Welcome to Scotland is Now, Race to Zero, a two-day conference brought to you by Team Scotland, a partnership approach led by Scottish Development International and Scottish Government, in collaboration with city regions and key stakeholders. We hope that you'll be able to join several of our sessions over the two-day event. Full details of the programme and our fantastic speakers can be found on the conference website, www.scotlandracetozero.co.uk. I am Mary Henderson from Scottish Development International, and I'm here to introduce our next session, which is Scotland's Shift to Sustainable Living. And I'd now like to hand over to Christina Gaiger, President of the Royal Incorporation of Architects in Scotland, who will be chairing this discussion. Christina.
Thanks, Mary, and good afternoon, everyone. It's really amazing to be here and have the opportunity to chair this Scotland is Now Race to Zero session on Scotland's shift to sustainable living, a really key topic at the moment. And I would imagine that the two key aspects really driving the conversation around housing today are the climate emergency and the relationship change that we've really undergone with our homes throughout the pandemic. Both of these things really show that change is required, but also that it can be achieved. So just to introduce myself, my name is Christina Gaiger, and I'm the President of the Royal Incorporation of Architects in Scotland. The RIS is the professional body for all chartered architects in Scotland, and our aim is to create a supportive architectural network to improve the quality of Scotland's built fabric. So really excited to hear from the panel today. We do have limited time, so I'd like to get underway. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first panellist, Councillor John Alexander, who's leader of Dundee City Council, and kicking us off with the question, how are councils like Dundee supporting developers to not only create more housing to meet demand, but also ensure that they reduce carbon emissions? Thanks, John. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Christina, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you've enjoyed the conference thus far. I'm delighted to be with you virtually today to talk about councils like my own and how we are taking forward this broad agenda in terms of meeting housing demand, which is a big challenge in itself, but also delivering homes that help us meet that zero carbon housing that's going to be required long into the future and help meet those national targets. I am both leader of Dundee City Council, but also chairman of the Scottish Cities Alliance, which represents all of Scotland's cities and is a partnership between them and the Scottish Government. So I will try to give examples in both contexts over the course of the next few minutes. And through both of those roles, I just want to give some specific examples, I suppose, in terms of how local government and councils in particular are driving forward with ambitious plans and developments, trying to support wider industry to make those changes that are going to be necessary over the coming years. Placemaking, of course, is at the heart of everything that we do. And as a very proud Dundonian, I want more than anything to see my hometown, my home city thrive and prosper. It's the people who live there who need to thrive. At the bedrock of that, their homes. They need communities to be proud of and they want to live in. And the Scottish Government have set out the sustainable path we should all follow with initiatives such as 20-minute neighbourhoods in the 4th National Planning Framework, which sustainable travel at its absolute core. Dundee is thriving in investment in active travel infrastructure and efforts to decarbonise travel, where the council leads with its own electric vehicle fleet and public transport companies, taxi firms are following suit. Dundee plan aims to help drive development in our city, citywide, of course, and there is a 5-year capital plan with £347 million of capital investment, as well as the Tay Cities deal, which will leverage in significant resource to make those changes that ultimately are necessary. In Dundee, we want the city to grow, so we need more housing, and in order to meet those ambitious net zero targets, that housing has to be sustainable. It has to last, and it needs to help us hit those national targets as we head towards COP26 and our pledge to be net carbon zero. So what else can we do to make it easier to build in Dundee? There are a few particular examples, I suppose, and how we develop that. And we work very closely with the private sector, but also with registered social landlords in the development of new opportunities. The majority of sites in Dundee are existing urban areas, so they utilise existing infrastructure and services. We offer positive engagement with developers at a pre-application stage with things such as a free pre-application advice session, I suppose, to make sure that we're identifying any of those particular issues in advance and making sure that everybody is on the same page. To take one example in a Dundee context, that's Derby Street, a former high-rise housing site in the north of the Hilltown area of the city. a huge regeneration project. And in line with the regeneration framework for the area, the site's provided an opportunity for innovative, high quality design, providing much needed housing in a really important area of the city, 163 units. It's working with Robertson's, Hillcrest Housing Association and the council to develop new housing in that area. It's really high quality, it's very energy efficient, and it's also affordable housing. And that combination of modern flats and detached and terrace homes absolutely addresses some of the shortages we see within the city context. Another example lies in the capital, where plans to revitalise Meadowbank into one of Edinburgh's greenest neighbourhoods underway, with plans for around 600 modern energy efficient homes. That master plan for council-owned land at Meadowbank will see £100 million leveraged into that project and expected to become the first development of its size in Edinburgh to promote the council's net zero carbon 2030 goal, creating a low carbon community, energy efficiency homes as well. It's all about that mixed use. It's about showcasing the best of technology, aspiration, and bringing that together with key partners in terms of how we end up delivering something of scale, also helps us meet those challenges in terms of climate. Over in Glasgow, they've been working on reducing carbon emissions in new build developments through their affordable housing supply programme. Housing associations and design teams have continually looked to develop flexible approaches to determine the most appropriate sustainability philosophy for the developments on a project basis. And some of the measures which you'll be live to include enhanced grant levels for greener homes, insulation levels for new homes, passive house standards, low and zero carbon generating technologies, having no new gas connections beyond 2024, electric vehicle charging, and much, much more. So there is a lot of incentive there. There's a lot of partnership. There are frameworks in place. There is funding available, and the ambition is there. And it's about bringing those various ingredients together to make sure that aspiration becomes a reality in each and every one of Scotland's cities. There is, of course, much more we can do, and we'll come on to talk about perhaps regulation and incentivisation of how we do more in a city context. But I think the examples, hopefully, I've provided give some tangibles as to how cities are very laser focused on making sure that we do our part in creating the housing of the future. We're working hard to support development, and we're bringing innovation, sustainability to the heart of what we do, whilst delivering the tenure of housing that is required for residents as well. So with all of that said, I'm really keen to hear from the other speakers and also move on to the Q&A. So I will finish up there. Thanks.
Thanks, John. That's great. A fantastic keynote introduction to the session. Really inspiring and a great start. So we actually have 4 further panelists with us today, exploring a variety of questions. So I'd just like to run through them and introduce them before we continue. So we have Michaela Sullivan, Chair of the Scottish Property Federation. We have Fiona Kell, Director of Policy for Homes for Scotland. Alexandra Notay, Placemaking and Investment Director for PFP Capital. And Calum Murray, Director of CCG Scotland Limited and Managing Director of CCG Homes Limited. So we're very grateful today for everyone's time, and obviously to John for kicking us off. So taking the next question is Michaela Sullivan, as I said, Chair of the Scottish Property Federation. And the question is, how can developers help support the net zero ambition for Scotland, and what support is needed to achieve this? It's a very key question. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina, and also thank you to John for that fascinating introduction. Developers obviously can and do support the targets, and that's very clear. Most of the major house builders have commitments to building operationally net zero homes, and there's also an increasing focus on office developments as well. So, you know, from a commercial real estate perspective, the way we live is not just about our homes, but also the workplaces that we occupy as well. So progress is being made towards these targets, I think, on a kind of 3-pronged basis, and that's driven by the building regulations, institutional investors and the targets that the institutional investors are setting and the challenges that they're setting to businesses that they fund, and also customer demands, both from occupiers and buyers, as people are becoming much more aware around these issues. It is, however, a complex area. And I think it's very important that everyone, including policymakers, agrees what we mean and how we measure, because quite a lot of the things that are said can be quite unscientific if we don't step carefully in this regard. And obviously, around that complexity, there's carbon in the construction process in terms of how we transport materials to site, how we operate sites. Do we use diesel generators? Can you use battery? All those kinds of complex things. And then there's carbon embedded in the materials that are used. And it's important to consider how those materials are manufactured. Where from? Can materials be recycled? Can even buildings be recycled and reused rather than building new? And those sorts of complex questions. And there's also the carbon performance and efficiency of the homes and the offices and so on that we occupy. And I think it's important for us to consider two main strands there. One is fabric, and the actual fabric of the building is probably the most important area within which we can reduce carbon. But then there's also heating and cooling, how we heat and cool the spaces. If you get the fabric right, you use less energy with the heating and cooling. And there's a subset of that around cost and what it actually costs the operators. And bringing into that equation, car charging also comes in, because that's another area which, if we're talking about the way we live, is going to become more important. So I think the support that we need, I think what we're not asking for, and this is very important, is a whole new carbon counting industry and a new set of reports that we have to submit with every application about those sorts of details. We need a full and clear plan to ensure that enough electricity is generated and that the grid can cope with the increased loads that are required. And that's probably the sort of number one thing that we need. We also need a policy environment that genuinely supports lower carbon. That's through scientifically based targets that take account of all factors, including cost versus benefits, fabric first, and also the long-term affordability in operation of what's being built. And also, I think this is very important. To meet the targets needs wider scale investment, because this is not just about new buildings. We probably replace about 1% of our building stock every year. So in order to become more carbon efficient, we actually need to look at things like heat network capacity and to consider the built environment as a whole, not just as new buildings. And we mustn't place disproportionate burdens on new buildings, but actually consider the overall built estate, and particularly in terms of heat networks and wider funding, so that developers can actually extend or connect onto planned networks, rather than expecting new development to perhaps be the genesis for the development of heat network capacity. So those are the main points that I'd like to make today, but I'm sure there'll be plenty of debate.
Thank you so much. I actually have tons of questions just off the back of that straight away, but I'm going to try and refrain until the Q&A at the end. So thank you so much, Michaela. Next up, we have Fiona Kell, Director of Policy for Homes for Scotland, with a really interesting question that's very on point in terms of where we are at the moment. It's what have been the challenges for the housing sector in delivering new housing, and how can they be overcome? And how has the housing demand shifted following COVID-19? So over to you, Fiona.
Good question. Not sure I can give a straightforward answer, but we'll give it a go. I think what's increasingly apparent is that over the last 12 months is that home is as a fundamental concept, it's essential for not just our economic growth and our economic recovery, but as a basic human right. And we know that there's no doubting the fact that health and education outcomes are both directly associated with our housing quality. So the last 12 months, more than ever, we've been looking at the four walls of our existing homes, and also realising those that don't have the benefit of having those four walls to look at. So home, no doubt, is very high on everyone's radar, and it will underpin Scotland's economic recovery. The fundamental problem that we've got is that if this is so important as an economic and a social tool to Scotland, why are we still not building enough homes? And we're not in Scotland. Back at the peak the previous recession, 2007, 2008, Scotland was building around about 25,000 new homes. Now we're gradually moving back up towards that, but we're not there yet. So at the minute we're sitting probably around about 23,000. So over this period, we've amalgamated around about an 80,000 home shortfall in Scotland. And now this is something really fundamental, that we're not just talking about building to provide for new households, but we're trying to capture the backlog that still exists in Scotland. So a really complex jigsaw. All of the housing system is interdependent. So in terms of what are the barriers to making it work, well, the entire system needs a mix of tenures, of sizes, of locations, of scale. It's issues of supply and demand. And a failure in just one of those bits of the jigsaw makes the whole system sluggish. So there's no point in just focusing efforts on dealing with one part of it. If we don't see the whole thing as a system, then we won't get the systematic changes that we need. From our point of view, we think we need to start with a really clear national vision and target that says we, as a country, need to be building 25,000 new homes a year. So yes, it's ambitious, but we've been there before. We can get back up to that. And that begins to set the overall tone in which all other decisions are made. So that we're saying, as a country, by having this vision, we're giving confidence to developers, to investors, to consumers, that we are serious about providing the homes that we need. It gives confidence to local authorities. They need to have investment in the local authorities to be helping the system deliver these new homes. Investment in the infrastructure and a planning system that's focused on development. But all of that stems back to, if we're able to clearly say, as a country, we are committed to building 25,000 new homes of all tenures. I think just focusing on one tenure or another doesn't fully reflect the complexity of the situation that we've got. So that's the position. We then overlay that with the drive for zero carbon, and that adds a whole other complexity on top of it. How do we deliver these homes that we need within the context of our zero carbon ambitions? We know that there has been significant progress to date. We've seen around about a 75% reduction in the operational emissions of new homes since about 1990. But if you look by 2050, 36% of the homes that will exist in Scotland will have been built to a 2010 standard or higher. And they will only account for 10.5% of the residential emissions in Scotland, which shows very clearly that the fundamental problem will remain with our existing housing stock. 73% of Scotland's housing stock was built before 1982, and incredibly of that, 19% was built before 1919, and a further 12% between 1919 and 1945. So that alone begins to give you an idea. So focusing all the effort on addressing new build is not going to tackle the real problem that we've got in Scotland. So there's a clear opportunity and risk, but opportunity for investors looking to move into the space. Very quickly then, in terms of some of the key issues for addressing the net zero: training, education, how are we making customers aware of the choices that they need to be making, and how do customers exercise that choice? How are we valuing this? So if you're trying to buy or rent a property, how is the value that you're getting from this operational efficiency embedded into the calculation of what your property is worth? Through regulation, yes, standards are already beginning to address, but that's predominantly for the new build. How are we addressing the retrofit? And finally, last but not least, the cost. There is an additional cost in providing these enhanced standards, whether that's the builder, the homeowner, the government, the investor. Confidence, a combination of all of them will be required to meet this capital investment that's required. And I think back to this target of having an aspirational target, that begins to give investors and developers the confidence that you're going to be building something within a system that recognises and values over the long term what it is that we need to be investing in.
Thanks, Fiona. I think, there's some really on-point statistics there, which are quite shocking, I suppose, when you get them in that order. The reality of actually the problem we're facing hits, especially with the figures in terms of the home shortfall. So there's some really interesting points raised there. I'm sure they'll be picked up on in the Q&A, if not just by myself, by lots of others as well. So thank you so much. So moving on, we now have Alexandra Notay, Placemaking and Investment Director for PFP Capital. With the question, what role does the rental sector have in supporting housing, and how has this changed following COVID-19, and what investment opportunities does this create? A very interesting question. So over to you, Alexandra.
Super, thanks, Christina. And I feel like I'm the nodding dog Churchill, agreeing with all the previous speakers, but I think that point that Fiona just made about needing homes across all tenures is actually this key point that for whatever reason in the UK, we have developed a cultural fixation with ownership. Above all else, we have a trickle of grant funding for social housing, which must be better funded, and we need more of across the UK and Scotland as well. But we have created a dependency on a sort of house building model, where house builders, their model is predicated on scarcity. They want to drip feed supply into the market to maximize their profits, which is entirely appropriate for them, but does not deliver the mix of tenures and flexibility of choice for citizens. And actually, mixed use, mixed tenure communities work best. They have better social outcomes. They're generally better quality places. But for whatever reason, where most Western economies have very established rental sectors in terms of construction and delivery, but also in terms of ownership and operation, the UK as a whole has lagged behind that. But there is now this real wave of institutional interest, as Michaela alluded to, in residential and specifically those rental tenures. Those institutional investors that we work with that want to hold portfolios over the long term actually give you real leverage to create better places, because you get away from that idea where you build stock and then the developer sells it into the ownership and it's no longer anyone's responsibility. The challenge as someone who's been working in sort of the sustainability end of real estate for 15 years is the kind of the speed at which this is changing and the lack of clarity around it. I was doing some digging around in my notes, and as a very junior civil servant in 2005, I worked when we had the EU presidency on the Sustainable Communities Bristol Accord, where we were all enormously proud of ourselves for coming up with these agreed principles around investment in cities and sustainability and building quality new homes. Until I remember sitting and listening to the interpreters for all the European ministers flicking through and realizing that because they found sustainable communities too difficult to define, they just left a gap. So actually all the ministers were looking terribly confused because the key thing that we were trying to discuss, nobody was interpreting to them. They couldn't agree what it meant. And I really worry that in a sector that is so full of jargon already, that there is real confusion when we talk about sustainability, when we talk about net zero, when we talk about carbon reduction, retrofit versus new build. There's so many different angles. And I think what we really need is that clarity and then allowing investors and developers to understand what they can and should do, but also customers. The big challenge that I see, having worked on a number of initiatives, is that in office or a retail portfolio, it's relatively homogenous and you have much more control. Very obviously, when we're talking about residential, it's people's homes. And so the level of disruption that when you start tinkering around with fabric can be really, really problematic. And when people have great new kit that could be solar panels or kind of new wall materials or whatever, that is a huge level of disruption, even just for a basic retrofit for residents. But then you also get into that kind of long-term cost and ownership cycle and maintenance. We've also run a number of behavioural studies that show that there's a sort of psychological challenge where people will commit to reducing their energy use for a time, but then sort of see that gap as sort of free energy to use, that as long as they're using less than they did before. then, it's a bit like calories. I know we've all been reaching for the biscuit tin during lockdown, but as long as I don't eat as many as I used to, then it's probably okay. I think getting people to understand the challenge of committing to a long-term reduction to get to net zero and quite how difficult that is really difficult. So where the rental sector, I think, has a real lever in that is where the owner, if it's an institution that's genuinely committed to ESG principles, and we are certainly seeing, night and day compared to 2 years ago in terms of the detail that questions that investors are asking. What you then have is, as PFP Capital, we have a fantastic mid-market rental fund in Scotland that is really working hard to deliver to the best existing standards with a new build, but also reviewing the new technologies that are coming up and trying to kind of balance that holistic need between delivering an investor return, a quality place for our customers, but also making it work for the long term. The challenge I tend to allude to is everybody wants to be the iPod, not the mini disc. And the challenge in this space is that everything's mini disc functionally perfect, and lots of newsdays will tell you it's the best quality, but actually wasn't really future-proofed. And there are plenty of examples of really good technology that's been implemented as a kind of pilot scheme that then communities or developments are stuck with because it's actually not future-proofing and in the way that we'd like to see. So I think what is fantastic with this event is seeing Scotland take a holistic view and understanding the interlinkages between the policy view that Councillor Alexandra was talking about at the city level, linking that in with the role of developers for new build, but also understanding that it can't all be driven by standards. There's millions of different sort of benchmarks and certifications. It's got to be about buying in residents, buying in the client, the customer, to understand their role in reduction to net zero as well.
That's a very good point. I think we have to take people with us, and it is an educational process as much as anything else. And I think it's really interesting to see how it's coming, through investment as well. So that's fantastic and really interesting. So thank you for that, Alexandra. So we're on to our last panelist today, Calum Murray, Director of CCG Scotland Limited and Managing Director of CCG Homes Limited, with the questions: what construction innovations are already being used to help deliver net zero homes? And how will CCG's net zero home standard support the Scottish Government's ambitions to be net zero carbon by 2045? I struggled to give a 3-minute answer to this, so over to you, Calum.
Thank you, Christina. Good afternoon to my colleagues on the panel and to our audience today. Most new build housing constructed in Scotland doesn't achieve net zero, as there's yet no legal requirement to so do. And traditionally, the construction sector has built to standards rather than to exceed them. So physically, as yet, there's very limited evidence of the coming change, but the coming change is going to come like a tidal wave. And typically, as John has identified, the affordable sector is leading that charge, underscored by its aspirations on climate change and for the laudable objective, the elimination of fuel poverty. So no surprise there, absolutely necessary. Their efforts, though, are being ably assisted and indeed arguably led by industry, and most uniquely in Edinburgh, where the city, the Scottish Government, the Construction Scotland Innovation Centre, and industry partners that includes CCG are collaborating on a highly innovative Edinburgh demonstrator. This initiative is seeking to improve procurement, to foster the acceleration and take-up of off-site modern methods of construction, and that's under intent to deliver a pipeline of net zero housing, affordable and private, across the wider city region. The Edinburgh City region is one of the 5th fastest growing areas of housing in the United Kingdom. This project and our own research demonstrates that transition is achievable in the short term, but it does require change to the typical fabric, the heating, and the renewable strategies that are currently in use. So significant change ahead. We embarked on the journey 18 months ago, and our intention was to understand the implications of net zero for our product within the context of the current regs and the forthcoming changes to the building regulations. We saw the need because of the weight behind the climate change agenda, and within which housing had been highlighted as a sector for near-term change. And bear in mind, we're about to flip to non-gas options as close as 2024. That's literally just around the corner. The particular reason we hit the research hard was that we build and manufacture 1,500 homes a year. 90% of them are in the affordable or social rented sector. Our aim at that point was, as I say, to review and to consider what was in the offing. But what we set about doing was to design a net zero new build strategy, which would be practical, affordable and deliverable, not in 2030, but now. And it is available now. The technology is with us, and it ain't rocket science, but it does cost, as Fiona has identified. The solution that we've adopted, embraced, is a fabric-first approach based on proven off-site manufactured closed panel timber system that we manufacture. Our IQ product, a product that's already 30% more energy efficient than the Scottish Government's own thermal bridging in their accredited details. It will deliver reduced space heating energy demand, and with a focus on non-gas solutions to provide space and water heating. That would be via air source heat pump or ground source heat pump. We've looked at minimising the risk of overheating, and we've set out fundamentally to demonstrate a reduction in energy costs to the end user, achieving in the process operational net zero as a standard. Our research considered the designed, operational, regulated energy use of the new build, and that looked at the dwelling emission rate. The dwelling emission rate considers heating, cooling, lighting from pumps and fans. So it was a fairly straightforward approach based on the existing tools at our disposal, the standard assessment procedure and the existing regulations. How do we take that? How do we mould it and deliver a product that we can roll out in the current market and within the current market in a relatively short period of time? The technical requirements, the energy performance advantage and the cost implications of delivering have been fully assessed by the business. The solution is scalable and it delivers significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and energy consumption. It's for us just to start, and we've embarked on the journey. We've proven to ourselves that we can do it. I suppose the next challenge is to demonstrate again to ourselves and our market and our clients in the affordable and indeed in the private housing sector that we can indeed make it truly affordable and reduce costs.
That's really interesting. I think it is, it's about reaching that clientele again. So it touches on a few things that people have brought up today. So thank you so much. And Calum, we'll move on to some questions. And actually, if you can stay there, I think the first one would be perfect to follow on from your talk. So there's a question come in, which is, should every new house from now on be built to passive house standards? So I don't know whether the net zero properties you were just discussing are passive house standard, but it's sometimes a step beyond. So how do you feel about that? Should every new house from now on be built to passive house standards?
Well, passive doesn't necessarily take you to net zero because it still requires a heating source. But that's obviously an objective that some local authorities have already set out to embrace. Edinburgh has identified in its public buildings, its public estate, to build to passive standard. Our own objective at the start of the journey 18 months ago, as I say, was to deliver something that was both practicable and affordable. And having built Scotland's first passive development around 8 years ago, it was the glorious figure of 8 units in the dormant estate down in the Borders. But hey, we got there. And it was a fantastic demonstrator for our business at that point in time. It certainly proved to our business. We build, as I mentioned, 1,500 houses a year, but it proved to us the challenges of building to passive. And one of the reasons that we embarked on our own net zero strategy was it was driven by not a brand, but it was driven by a standard that we could work to and manufacture to cost that would provide our customers, clients, tenants and owner occupiers genuine savings in use. And we firmly believe that we've been able to achieve that. And we're working presently with Edinburgh to bring forward 2 schemes. One of those is a major project in in Granton, which will deliver 455 houses to net zero. So not to passive. We don't see that as being absolutely necessary, but it's a likely outcome of the impending legislation.
That's great, Calum. Thank you. And it helps to shed a light on where we are in terms of, what's happening at the moment, which is really helpful. So the question from Alan Smith, it's quite a long question, so bear with me. So as I understand it, majority of PLCs remain at capacity. More needs to be done to support our SME house builders and developers to work towards producing more homes for Scotland. Finance remains a key issue for SME sector in Scotland, and if you have an SME wanting to deliver a net zero carbon home, then there are very few funders who will support this. What support is out there for SMEs? I note SNIB set minimum investment at 1 million, which rules out the majority of SME projects. So I don't know who wants to pick this up. Alex, I don't know whether it's one for you or... Sorry to put you in the hot seat.
No, it's like, there is a point that, in continental Europe, between 50 and 60% of all housing annually is delivered by SMEs. And in the UK, we are, sub 10. So we have a long way to go in supporting that sector. I think, again, in England, Homes England as an agency has done a huge amount to support SMEs and put funding both into modular provision and much of what that kind of thing that Calum was talking about. So I think for Scotland, that kind of work is clearly underway, and I'd probably suggest that sort of Fiona or other colleagues might want to jump in on that with a pure Scottish perspective.
Yes, certainly. We worked during 2019 with Scottish Government and other partners in developing what we refer to as an SME recovery plan. The shortfall that I mentioned in terms of the housing numbers in Scotland, if we got the Scottish SMEs building to the same volume that they were building back at pre-2007-8, we would be hitting that target of 25,000 homes a year. So just by dealing with the SMEs, we would be tackling that, and not only would we be tackling that shortfall, generally would be in more diverse locations across Scotland where many of the larger PLCs would build. So we fully support and are working actively looking at the SME sector. But the person who's asked the question is entirely correct. Access to finance is a really major issue. Now, the Scottish Government were very supportive this time 12 months ago when we went into lockdown. There was a small scale home builder liquidity fund that helped some of the smaller home builders stay afloat for those few months of lockdown. But now that phase has passed and we're beginning to look at longer term development finance issues, that's where the real market failure is at the moment. And whilst we are keen to talk to Scottish National Investment Bank about it, quite rightly that their priority is often on some of the larger schemes. But the question, I'm happy to engage in further discussion offline with the questioner and see what else we can do.
That's fantastic. Thank you. It's good to know that there are people you can go to and outlets you can have to have these conversations, and that's why we're here today as well. So it's great that these topics are coming up. So I think to move on to the next question, is there a plan to make low carbon old houses more valuable within the current housing market? So I suppose this is a two-pronged question in terms of how do you retrofit and bring an old building up to standard, similar to what you said, Fiona, with your statistics, which I think is really interesting. And then there's also an aspect of what Alex was talking about in terms of value and housing as an asset. Fiona, I don't know whether you want to pick that up straight away in terms of how we can make houses more valuable and maybe what that might mean. Elaborate a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole issue of valuation is really difficult. And it's fundamental if we are serious about meeting our zero carbon targets. There is an additional cost incurred in making, whether it's an existing property or a new build property, there is an additional cost required to bring that property down, and it becomes a carbon cost tipping point that so much of the reduction can come, and then that final bit of reduction requires investment, and there's no doubt about that. And if you look at it and I'm looking at it primarily from owner-occupied properties, if you're buying a property and the valuer hasn't valued that 25, 30 year inherent operational efficiency of that property. If that's not valued in at the outset, then if you're sitting looking at a comparable property that's maybe 10 years older, 20 years, sitting down the street that doesn't have the operational efficiency, but is selling for £10,000 cheaper. So do you as a customer value it? So I think a large part of it comes down to customer education. What does the customer value? At the minute, if you say to a customer buying a new build property, you can have £10,000, would you like an enhanced kitchen or would you like an air source heat pump in your property? I'm sure pretty much none of them are going to be asking for that. So it really comes back to educating the consumer to be driving that. And then that then begins to get reflected then in the valuations and the finance model.
Thank you. That's great. So I suppose there's a question building on this a little bit, and I'll maybe throw Michaela into the hot seat a little bit in terms of any plans to help owners for insulation grants in order for old buildings to achieve better sustainability and energy efficiency. You know, do you know what's on the table essentially?
I know there are various sort of UK government-backed plans like Green Deals and so on and so forth. But I do think it's an area that, governments, both sides of the border, are actually going to have to get a grip on because of the figure that we all understand that most of the building stock is already here. And I know that there are sort of pilots and considerations in Scotland about the potential for heat networks. And that is something that the Scottish Government wants to focus on. And I think it's something that ultimately, if Scotland were to learn from the experience of neighbours in Scandinavia and other countries, potentially to be able to get a grip on that. But what I'm not sure of at the moment is how it's all going to be funded, and I don't think that there's a great deal of clarity around that. There have been a few ideas, certainly in sort of forums and things I've been in, where we've been talking about these things. And one of the ideas that I know has been discussed was removing stamp duty on sale from properties which are more energy efficient. And that would potentially give, when Fiona was asked earlier about the value of properties and so on, it gives people an incentive because they think their house is worth more because the stamp duty wouldn't have to be paid, or LBDT or whatever we call it now. We all know what we mean, that tax. So there are lots of things that we need to consider like that, I think, to be actually quite bold as a nation in order to create these incentives and make it possible for people to upgrade the existing housing stock as well as build to higher standards. But unfortunately, I don't have the kind of magic answer as to how it's all going to happen.
I think we all wish we did a little bit, but it's great to be discussing it, and these questions are coming up, and we're all pushing in different ways, which is fantastic. I'm going to go to John now. Sorry, John, if I'm putting you on the spot here, but there's a question that's come in. How can we have no new gas connections when the whole gas grid is gearing up towards hydrogen? And there's a note about expenditure in Fife at the moment, for example. So I'm just throwing you into this to see your thoughts on it.
No, that's absolutely fine, Christina. And clearly, there are opportunities on the horizon, and the Leavenmouth Fife example is one. And I know that one of my colleagues from Aberdeen was talking about the hydrogen agenda in an Aberdeen context. Likewise, Dundee's developing a hydrogen offer, which is more focused on vehicles rather than kind of energy networks and heating systems. But I think the point at which we're at right now, the key concern is perhaps one of the points that were just made a moment ago, which is the financing of the transformation that's going to be required going forward. And whilst the aspiration is absolutely clear, if we don't have the funding available to meet that aspiration, then we're going to fall down at the first hurdle. I think one of the key things that partners are looking at, and I know Scottish Government and local government in particular, is making sure that we also don't put all of our eggs in one basket. Now, there is clearly an incentive in exploring the opportunity that might arise from using hydrogen within current gas heating networks. But there are also significant challenges in terms of the production of that hydrogen, in terms of the transmission of the hydrogen, because the metal pipework corrodes with hydrogen. So there are huge investment challenges that are required by the gas networks in themselves, as well as looking at production and how that hydrogen is created. The other part of that, I suppose, is those national targets, because the reality is that in order to create the infrastructure and to transition the entire country to a position where we're using hydrogen within our network, there isn't another nation in the world. We're going to have to be the pioneers and the innovators, and that requires a significant amount of resource, far more than is on the table at either a UK or a Scottish level at this point in time. So I think the opportunities to test technology and innovate are there, and they are being taken forward, but we can't wait to find out whether they are fully proven, I suppose, as suitable and acceptable going forward. So in the meantime, we have to absolutely explore the use of electrification, I suppose, of energy networks, and focusing on heat pumps and ground source heat networks, etc., district heating systems and others, and make sure that we're not putting all of our eggs in one basket, so to speak. I think there is some significant challenge with gas-fired boilers in particular. From council perspective, it's what we know, it's what we've been doing for decades, and to then suddenly transition over to new arrangements, which also have a bearing upon the finances, but also the network that exists, national grid, etc. We need to be mindful that the infrastructure isn't quite there, whether it's hydrogen or electricity at this point in time. So there are huge challenges. I think the reality is we're trying to explore the technologies that might be best deployed in which context, but it won't all be hydrogen, and it certainly all won't be electrical either. And it's about taking them both forward as quickly as we can to realise the full potential and deliver on the net zero targets that we have.
Thanks, John. That's very clear. I'm just going to try and squeeze in one last question for Calum, actually, which asks, has there been any feedback from RSLs on whether they will be able to get sufficient, sorry, I'm not up with the acronyms here, HAG, to fund the additional initial costs associated with ground source heating, for example. So it's a fantastic idea with long-term gains, but there needs to be commitment from funders to make it work. So has there been any feedback from RSLs on whether they'll be able to get sufficient funding?
I think that's a question that's been asked at this very moment. Christina, unfortunately, I don't have the answer for you, but the questioner refers to Housing Association grant. And I do know that there are active discussions between RSLs and local authorities and national government, with a view to understanding how they're going to pay for things like sprinkler systems and net zero, and the changing building regulations is the next major event that will kick in to our design calendar and to our cost base. So there's a very real question in there, because we can't hide from cost. And as we come out of a pandemic where cost and investment is going to be under tremendous scrutiny, then we need to find new and more novel ways of delivering our projects, and perhaps getting creative with our housing association funding in the process.
That's a very good point, and I think it crosses over quite a few areas, as you've said, in terms of how things are funded. So thank you, Calum, that's appreciated. So I think, I'm conscious of time, and I think it'd be lovely to get a kind of closing remark from all of our panelists. So if we want to kind of almost start from the front to back with a closing remark or any thoughts. So John, I'll start with you first.
Thanks very much. I think, through the conversation that we've had today, it's abundantly clear that there are huge challenges on the horizon, and the ambition doesn't necessarily mean that we'll meet every single one of those targets going forward. I think there's a willingness and a keen interest to make sure that we work across private and public sector to leverage in as much resource as possible to de-risk projects and to prove concept as well. And I'm sure that will continue to accelerate. And I think, in the run-up to COP26 in particular, providing that platform for not only Scotland but the UK to showcase what our ambition is, it provides everyone with an incentive to push that even harder. I think the close working relationship between the private and the public sector is the only way we can make a tangible difference and a real inroad into this agenda. And it won't be through one particular means. There is no panacea in terms of delivering net zero. It will not be purely through hydrogen. It will not be purely through any one type of technology. It will not be through purely retrofitting. And we need to take a varied approach, which looks at the best technology available, anticipates what the costs are going to be, and delivers a product that we can scale up fairly rapidly in order to achieve those targets that we all want to see. So, the ambition is there. I think we're all working towards the same ends. Now we've just got to find a way of making it work.
Thanks, John. Michaela?
It's hard to add a great deal to what John's just said, because I think he's summed the whole debate up extremely nicely for us. There is a huge amount to go at here, and it does need a clear policy framework, and it does need funding. And the only way that's going to be made to work will be a partnership between public and private. And I think that we can all be clear on that. But the form that partnership takes, and the way that the type of investment that's going to be needed can be supported, is a challenge for the future, I think. I think, we all have a part to play in this. The development industry are represented here today, the councils who are represented here today, RSLs, investors. There's an imperative need for a lot of people to be involved. But at the moment, I think we're down at the sort of, first third of the curve, perhaps, and there's 2/3 of the curve still to go in the future.
Fantastic. Thank you. Fiona, would you like to add any remarks?
Yeah, I think just to add onto that, I think that back to what I was referring to at the outset, of having this idea of an all 10-year target, and what the number is actually kind of slightly less important than what it's actually saying. And what it's actually saying is that we, Scotland, need more homes. Now, by a national government coming out and saying that clearly and strongly, that message then pervades down into local authorities, out to investors, out to the wider supply chain, to those that are looking to skill the future workforce, because there's a commitment to longer term delivery. And if you have that commitment, then you're happier to invest. So if you're pardon me, if you're the manufacturer of air source heat pumps and you're thinking, well, is demand going to be up and in a few years' time they're going to move on to something else? If you know that there's a genuine commitment to longer term, this is what we have to do, then you're prepared to invest in that. So that's why I think something that's coming out from government that's very clear, saying that housing is a priority for us, would start to give some more of that investor confidence that we need.
Fantastic. Thanks, Fiona. Over to you, Alex.
Again, I agree with everything colleagues have said, private-public collaboration, that holistic approach to product. But for me, I think, there are hundreds of different certifications and benchmarks, and particularly for housing, where you have such a range of typologies of stock. As an architect, it's one of the headaches for you guys, I imagine. But, we've got to get away from going, is it to passive house? Is it to this standard? Is it to that benchmark? And actually much more to Fiona's bigger point about, wider quality ambitions that drive to net zero just across the piece, and benchmarks and certifications can help drive you to that to a point, but we shouldn't be steered by them. That is the epitome of the tail wagging the dog. We've got to get that much more holistic approach about these. This means it's a better quality place to live. Something we haven't touched on here, but it's something that really drives a lot of what we're doing in terms of looking at the stock that we create. Indoor air quality in the UK is generally 5 times worse than outside, which is appalling. And something we have to tackle, as we've seen, as we've all spent more time in our homes, that's something really, really important. That's something that the customer can get their head around, wanting, cleaner and being able to breathe properly. So there are certifications and benchmark standards around that, but I think it's just about being able to take that much more holistic view. And I think understanding the scale of the challenge, the International Energy Agency does a global status report every year for buildings and construction. 40% are from existing global emissions is from existing buildings. Aviation is, depending on which stat you take, between 2 and 10%. we all point at the kind of, we can see the vapor trail from an aeroplane, so it becomes a lot more tangible. But actually it would do so much more if you could get that educational piece that colleagues have mentioned, that behaviour change really embedded in people's psyche, that we could change that through the way that we approach our homes, not just the way that they're built in the fabric, but the way that they're used and they're operated. And that, I think, is a real key. And where the innovation and the pilots and the experimentation, you know, Scotland being able to lead in that and all the different kind of things that Calum and Councillor Alexandra have talked about is fantastic, because somebody has to lead in this and we all have to start adopting it sooner rather than later.
Thanks so much. Calum, over to you.
Christina, there's a wonderful opportunity in all of this for us. We've got a magnificent manufacturing capability in Scotland, particularly in timber manufacture, and our construction sector, I would argue, is second to none. So as a manufacturing entity, a construction entity, we are right up for this. The big challenge, as Alex has just identified, is actually in the existing stock. And that's where the opportunity lies, because there's a huge task to be undertaken across that stock base. And that presents a huge labour requirement, a huge skills requirement, but in itself, a huge opportunity coming out of a pandemic. And that should be one of the key drivers of our green recovery. But undeniably, there are challenges beyond. And the key challenge in terms of private sector housing delivery is really to put the net zero message out there, to change culture and mindset, and to demonstrate that it brings and adds value to the product and benefit to the housing transaction. Critically, as Fiona recognised, that has to be identified and advanced by our valuers and lenders. And I know the RICS are presently doing some work in this, but that becomes absolutely critical for me. The market will gravitate towards trends, and as the popularity of net zero energy homes increases, so will resale values. We should not be afraid of this challenge.
Thank you. That was really powerful. And I think, you know, I feel almost funny coming in after all of those remarks with some kind of closing statement, because there's power in what everyone said. And I think just picking up on a couple of the key points, you know, the learning from each other, the public-private, is so important. And I think, you know, even the title of the event, The Race to Zero, you know, we are up against a clock. And I think there has to be, you know, it's a wonderful word, collaboration. It sounds lovely, doesn't it? But you know, in a commercially driven environment, that's not what we're inclined to do. But I think this is a slightly exceptional circumstance in which collaboration between public and private has come right to the fore. It's echoed across the discussions today, even in terms of the statistics, the aims of everyone, you know, on the panel, the willingness, you know, that Calum's, you know, referring to from the construction sector. And I think that that's a really great thing. And there is that opportunity. That culture mindset is really difficult. You're seeing it in certain product development, in certain areas of the economy where, you know, younger generations, carbon savvy generations are actually demanding it from companies and products. They want to work for companies that are pushing those boundaries. How do we get that through to trickle right the way down through our housing stock and actually attitude to purchase, to product in terms of housing? And, you know, that's the investment and the generator. That's how things start and are driven. But I think we can't wait for that. So again, it's about that, you know, bringing together the two sides, driven from within, collaboration between all parties, public and private, and almost that commercial challenge. That there's a financial gap that I think everyone's identified, and maybe is the question mark from today, and maybe the call to action for how we're dealing with some of these items in terms of finance in Scotland, to be the pioneers that almost everyone's alluded to with the opportunity that's there today. So it's been an absolute pleasure chairing the panel. I've learned so much. I've written down so much. Sorry, so if I was looking down, I was actually scribbling because it was so informative. So thank you to everyone today. So I'm just going to hand over to Mary for closing remarks, but thank you to our whole panel and thank you to the audience.
Thank you, Christina. And again, can I just reiterate my thanks to the panel as well for an insightful and inspirational discussion. And thank you, audience, for joining us and for asking such great questions. We hope that you can join us for one of the other sessions that are taking place as part of our Scotland is Now Race to Zero 2-day conference. The programme, that's us finished for today. The programme for tomorrow's session should now be showing on your screen. And the next session will be Growing the Green Economy in conversation with the Scottish National Investment Bank at 9:15 a.m. tomorrow. The link to join the next panel that panel is in the Zoom chat, and your links for all the sessions are included in the interactive programme. Also in the programme, in the Get in Touch section, is the team email address. Please get in touch to speak with the team. We welcome inquiries from any investors, developers or stakeholders who are interested in the projects mentioned over the course of the next 2 days, or if you would like more information about investing in Scotland, we'd love to hear from you. We look forward to seeing you again tomorrow, and thank you very much.